Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for Human Factors in Your Hands. You'll see I think on your machine you can ask questions as you go along, and we'll try our hardest to answer those questions at the end. We've really put together this webinar to discuss how usability fits into the regulatory framework, but also how usability can be used for much more than just regulatory compliance. So first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Lucy Sheldon. And I'm also here with my colleague, Louise. Good afternoon. So I've been working in the application of usability to the development of medical devices for about 15 years now, working both understanding the needs of users and also applying their needs and their capabilities to the development of new medical products, both from the inception of early concepts right through to the validation of those devices for regulatory purposes, both within drug delivery and medical devices.
And my background is very much covering sort of a wide spectrum across in vitro diagnostics, medical devices, and drug delivery, looking at things from a development perspective, but also where that interface with regulators comes in, and making sure that sort of ultimately the product that is going into that submission is compliant and beneficial to the end user.
So during today's webinar, we'll take a little bit of a step back and look at what usability is from a high level, then discuss, therefore, what a user interface for a medical product is, how we apply usability engineering to the development of medical products and devices. Then Louise will touch on use risk mitigation, and the broader regulatory framework for usability within medical products. So, looking at usability at a high level, any tool, product, service, whether medical or not, its aim is to address human needs. The way it does that is by amplifying and complementing our human capabilities. This tool or product or device converts what we can do with our capabilities to fulfill what we want to be able to do. A great tool is designed to fit both sides, the capability of people and their desire to fill a need. One side needs to fit the problem, another one fits the person. And usability as a process incorporates these human needs and these human capabilities into the product development process. A user interface is that space within a product or that part of a product where users or actors can interface with a technology, or where they can get feedback from a system or device. And the image you see on your right, this is the perception, cognition, action model, which exists in certainly 62366, and I think also the FDA regulatory framework, to discuss what the scope of an interface is, how the person reacts to the interface, and also how the system or device acts to the interface. So in this diagram, the system or device is below, and the human processes are above. So examples of interfaces are things like buttons, handles, screens, switches, basically anything that relays information to or from a product. A key document which is part of all regulatory submissions within the realm of usability is the use specification. And while these can be quite lengthy documents, they're very much the most simple way to think about them is to look at the 6 Ys. Don't know if any about 6 Ws, except one of them's an H, which are what, where, who, why, when, and how. And that's really what a use specification does. It creates a background of knowledge about who the users are, what their capabilities are, what other aspects of their profiles in relation to how they can interface with the product. It talks about the environment where that product might be. Is it a home environment? Is it a hospital environment? Is it a surgical environment? And matching up who we're talking, who the users are, whether it's patients, nurses, doctors, surgeons, and where the product is, provides very important context for the usability engineering process. Also in the use specification is a description of what the user interface is at a very high level, what all those buttons and switches are on the final version of a product, what the purpose of the product is, why, what needs it is filling, when it is used, in terms of what are the use scenarios, what point in a medical procedure, what point in a medical process this product is used, and also how it's used, what is, in what ways are users interfacing with it, and what is it doing. So this use specification is a very high level document, but also very, very useful for laying the foundation of what the usability engineering process is. It's one of the first things that we will always create on a project, so we can really start to understand who our users are, where they're using the product, why they're using the product, when and how. So in terms of assessing user interfaces, there's 2 types of approaches to understanding whether the concept of an interface or the detailed design of an interface is appropriate. One of the ways that this can be done is via expert evaluation. That involves getting usability specialists or domain-related specialists with experience of that particular type of product to evaluate the interface, the hypothetical interface or the concept interface, using in a paper-based manner, based on their expertise and human sciences more generally. So the types of things you can look at an expert evaluation or consider is anthropometrics, people's capabilities, psychology, people's likely understanding within a certain scenario or context. And also there's a lot of guidance out there on interface design, best practice that's been developed over the years from many different sectors. And by looking through all those lenses and thinking about all those aspects, it can be a relatively valuable but quick exercise to evaluate a concept or existing user interface via an expert evaluation. The second way that is perhaps more listeners may be more commonly aware of is simulated use testing. Simulated use testing, by comparison, and enables intended users of that particular product or device to use prototypes or some kind of prototype to undertake or attempt to undertake the use steps that they would do with a final product. As the product develops, perhaps initially it'll be prototypes will be low in fidelity. They may even be pieces of paper or pictures. But as the product develops, those prototypes become a higher level of fidelity. They start to look and feel closer like a final product. So you might get everything from paper through to a final manufactured product. Also, the way that you undertake the simulated use testing may also develop. So for something like a surgical product, it may be beneficial to actually do that user testing using a highly realistic phantom. However, in the early stage of the development, that may not be possible, and there might be more low cost and simple ways of creating a simulated use environment at low cost when you have a lower fidelity model. With very medically invasive products, it is also possible to undertake usability evaluation as part of a clinical trial, because sometimes it really is only through having an actual person or intended patient there in order to check the usability of a product. However, most of the time, this can often be done simulated use testing in a small room with nothing more than the product and the discussion. So thinking about the purpose of usability in the regulatory framework, usability is one of the primary reasons why there's no regulation within for usability within the regulatory space is because there over the years there's been increasing knowledge and understanding that use error has the potential to cause patient harm. And so the usability process provides a framework for exploring, understanding, and ultimately quantifying use error, and therefore the potential for patient harm as a result of a poor user interface. So use error can be caused by a number of different aspects. So if we look back at this perception, cognition, action model, at the top you have the user processes. So the users perceive information from the interface, they process that information, decide what to do with that information, and make a decision about what to do next. And then the user will do something. It's also called the see, think, do model, which is a bit more simple to understand. You see something, you think about it, and you decide to do something, which is often a bit more accessible than perception, cognition, action. But if we look at each of those, perception to start with, the kind of things where a user interface can fall down and expose patients to risks associated with use error are in perception. The first one is the ability to see visual information. So if visual information is not easy to distinguish, the contrast is bad, it's too small, then there's going to be a breakdown in the ability for the user interface to be effective, or in this case, safe and effective. There's ability to hear auditory information the same. Something's not loud enough, it can't be distinguished from other products. That's another way that perception perception can lead to use error. And the final one is the ability to feel feedback. So it's the ability to actually for example, feel force on a catheter or feel that a button has been pressed. Some examples of that. The next way that use error can occur is via the cognition step, so the think step. So the first thing is a memory failure. So this is the user may forget something, they're not able to hold something in their mind at a particular point, which is relevant to making a decision, and therefore an incorrect decision is made. There can be a rule-based failure where the user may misapply an accepted rule to something which it shouldn't be applied to. And finally, there's knowledge-based error, where a user may believe an interface works or a product works in a particular way, and therefore act on that device in an unexpected or improvised manner, or in a manner relating to what they already know in the real world. Finally, there's use errors which can be caused by action. So that's a failure for somebody to be able to do something. Something's too high up, you can't reach it. Something is too difficult to press, a button's too difficult to press, so you just literally can't do it. There's another action error is accidentally not being able, or accidentally doing something which is not intended. That's accidentally pressing a button, which you didn't mean to do, or knocking something, or tipping something. The final one is ability to control doing something. So while it can be done, perhaps the fine motor control, for example, to turn a small dial or push something a small distance, might be something that either that person cannot control, either because of their capability or because of the interface being having greater expectations than the intended population. So looking at the product development process and where user-centered design fits into it, this graphic shows a process from identifying user needs all the way through to validating a user interface. So the first step in the process, where usability engineering first comes into play, is actually about understanding need. And if we think back to the analogy at the start of this presentation, that's about understanding the problem. So that may be the first time when a understanding of workflows and users can begin to feed into a product development. Understanding the needs of users, the scenarios of use, and the process in which a user interface needs to work can be translated into user requirements. These are more used for broad validation activities, but they're also a key element in usability validation specifically. So these include the use specification we discussed earlier, the 5 W's and an H, and also pull out some of the hazard-related usage scenarios. So this term, I think Louise will talk about this a bit later. But these are essentially all those times when a user interface could inadvertently cause patient harm via a use error. So usability engineering does have a role to play before there's even a user interface in play, by really understanding the workflows and the people and the environments involved in that are central to the design of a medical device. Once a concept exists and has been created, this is when formative evaluations can begin, whether desk-based or within simulated use, in order to explore different options for an interface. There may be different ways that an interface can be embodied, different ways that different parts of it can be interacted with it, i.e. different handle sizes, different buttons, switches, foot pedals, different ways of interaction. And these can be explored very early via formative evaluations. Once an interface concept has been chosen, we know it's going to be a handle, it's going to have this many buttons, then it's useful, rather than waiting right until just before regulatory submission to validate that user interface, it's actually very easy to undertake a pre-validation of that user interface when it's still at a concept level before detailed engineering has taken place, just to make sure that interface is right. What that does is it allows you to freeze that interface in time, so that the energy can go into developing the engineering with the confidence that the interface is correct. Next, throughout the design stage, there's more formative evaluations. At this point, it's not about checking the concept for the interface is right, it's about optimizing that interface and further mitigate any risks that might be inherent through the detailed design of those buttons, of that interface. So that might be the size of the handle, the force of the buttons, the visual messaging that helps people identify a certain action is needed or what that action will do. Further down the process, there's the refining of instructional information and training. which may or may not be needed, depending on the complexity of the device. But that in itself, while we haven't spoken about it so far, is an inherent part of the interface, because it is a piece of information or instruction that enables that interface to be used safely and effectively. Finally is the validation, which is often the key aspect for the regulatory submission, which really at that point, it's just about generating the data to show the interface is safe. The interface in itself should have been tested much earlier, and it should at that point purely be a box ticking exercise with enough numbers to reach to meet the regulatory requirements. Finally, usability doesn't end there, because there's often some very useful information that can come from post-market information, which may then feed the requirement for an improvement to an interface or a device going forwards. So that's the usability engineering process, although as you'll notice from the slide, it's actually, I've described it here as the user-centered design process, and you could argue they are one and the same. So looking at the risk mitigation process within 4 user interfaces, there's different ways that you can reduce use error and therefore reduce the risk of patient harm. And some of these have got more impact than others, but they're also relating to the previous the diagram on the previous slide. So working backwards, if refining instructional information, instructions for use, product information leaflets, quick start guides, manuals, and making changes to training approaches, whether that's peer-to-peer training, whether that's including simulations, upgrading your materials, these things are known more broadly as information for safety. And these do have some impact on reducing use error and can be part of the mitigation strategy for use error. However, they're not always the most effective. So moving right, another option is safety mechanisms. These are called protective measures. So these are things like safety guards to cover a button, shielding to cover an unsafe part of the product, warning screens or pop-ups on a user interface to remind users to do or not to do something, or perhaps limited access passwords, ensuring that only relevant trained users can access something. And while these as well can be good mechanisms for mitigating use error, again, there are things you can do before that, before a user interface is tied down, that has the potential to have greater impact on reducing use error. So if you look at the user interface design itself, there's ways that the visual messaging for that interface can guide users towards doing the right thing. If the visual messaging of a product shows people how that product is likely to be used, I think the analogy I always like to use is children's Duplo. If all medical products, especially home use products, were as easy to understand as putting together some pieces of Duplo, nobody would ever get it wrong. And yet, quite often there's complexities in medical devices which haven't been designed out within the user interface, and forces people to have to think beyond what perhaps might be necessary in a stressful situation, or when you're at home for the first time with a medical device that you've never had to use on your own. So there's ways that the product in itself can communicate better to the users of what people are meant to do with it, users are meant to do with it. Another option is something called Poka-Yoke connections. So this is a way of, through the user interface, stopping somebody doing something incorrectly. So where the first one is about guiding people to do something properly, Poka-Yoke connections is about making sure that people don't do something not properly. So a 3-pin plug is the perfect example of a Poka-Yoke connection, because you can't plug it in the wrong way. However, I've seen many cases of medical devices where you can connect a connector to the wrong connection, even though doing so may, if you turned that machine on or used it, having those things connected could result in patient harm. Another example is a readability of information with the user interface. So is the readability or understanding of information, does an icon make sense? Do people know what that icon means? Does that word really communicate what it needs to within an interface? So there's some things that can be done within the interface itself, some examples. There are many more, certainly. However, if you take it, so that's called safety by design, and in that yellow bubble, it's about the design of the user interface. But there's also another level which Louise and I felt wasn't always taken into account within the usability engineering programs at a lot of medical and pharma companies, and that is actually safety via the design of the concept itself, making the concept inherently safe. It's not just about making the user interface as safe as possible, but it's actually taking it up a level. So what's the format of that technology? Is even the technology used the right technology, or is there a technology that could be applied which would decrease the complexity of user interactions or increase the ability for people to generate a correct mental model in the first time they use a concept? So our feeling is that usability engineering is actually not always applied early enough when critical decisions around the format of a technology. Is it an injection product, or is it a tablet? Would be an interesting example. Is that appropriate for that user group and that use environment and that use scenario, if you look at pharma specifically? So I'm going to have to pass over to Louise, and she's going to talk a little bit more in detail about the regulatory aspects.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lucy. So on your screen now, it's very much the FDA waterfall design process, and we're kind of showing this right now just to kind of really show where that usability kind of is intended to fall into that whole process. And it's right at the beginning, when you're anticipating what your user needs are, and you're bringing your user in right from the start. And that may be that you've got an existing product already on the market, or there are existing products that you're aware of that do a similar thing to the device that you're intending on developing. So it's really worth actually considering your user needs early on and kind of feeding that through your whole process. As we linking back to the sort of this whole concept of user-centered design, it's really valid to kind of revisit what those user needs are at every step of your process, just to kind of make sure that you really are doing everything with your end user in mind, whether that be right at the point of considering what your design inputs are, through to the end of actually doing your validation and preparing for your regulatory submission. So a lot of you will have heard of IEC 62366 Part 1, which was issued in 2015, which is the commonly used standard for the application of usability engineering to medical devices. For those working sort of in Europe as well as in the US, the two documents, so 62366 Part 1 and the FDA's Applying Human Factors and Usability Engineering to Medical Devices, are largely aligned. There are some terminology differences between the two documents, but usually you're in a position where if you're designing a new device, or you're looking at that device development side of things, a combined approach will meet the requirements on both sides of the Atlantic, providing that you're kind of considering this document as you go. So it's worth pointing out, with the advent of the medical device regulation in Europe, this is another one of those standards that is not currently harmonized. So as with anything state of the art, if you're looking to implement 62366 Part 1, which we strongly advise that you do, it's worth just having another check against the medical device regulation to see what the additional requirements are, to make sure there aren't any gaps. Back on the FDA for the moment, there are a list of the highest priority devices for human factors review. So this is a number of different types of devices. So auto-injectors are in there, insulin delivery systems, negative pressure wound therapy, robotic surgery devices. I'm not going to go through the whole list because we'd be here all day. These are the devices where FDA are expecting to see human factors test reports and data, or a detailed rationale that a human factors test reporting isn't necessary. FDA are really starting to sort of look for this. It doesn't mean that if your device isn't on this list that you shouldn't be doing human factors. That's absolutely not the point that we're trying to get across here. It's just worth considering that the agency focus is increasing relative to the implementation of human factors requirements. And actually incorporating human factors early into your device development can help to mitigate any delays in device approval, and it also has the potential to decrease patient injury, even product malfunction, and also potentially stop those class recalls starting as well. So looking at the risk management side of things, this is very much what Lucy was referring to earlier. So you're looking to do an analysis of the use steps documented in the task analysis. So how is your device actually intended on being used? That should lead you to a determination of where those potential risks due to user error can come up. And that allows you to then feed back into the device requirements and then update your designs accordingly. It's also obviously worth looking at any existing market or complaints data. MAUDE in the US is a particularly good source for some of this as well, but it's not the only thing, and allow that to inform your risk management. Risk management, as the number of people are sort of continually referencing at the moment with the advent of 14971 2019, it's not a process that you kind of come in at a certain point of your design inputs and chop and change, and then you leave it and you come back to it. It's a life cycle process. So you should be using your user inputs right at the beginning to consider where you need to be designing for your user and your end user. So in terms of your final summary reporting, validation reporting, depending on what you're calling it, will depend slightly on whether you're doing a US submission or a European submission. But your human factors engineering report included in your pre-market submission should be providing information about your device use, safety and effectiveness in a summary format. If you're in a situation where you're going into a summative study and you're not quite sure what you're going to find, the unexpected surprise notwithstanding, then really all you're doing is a very expensive formative study. So you really need to be in that position where your summative study is, you're at a situation where you're fairly confident what those results are going to be. So your usability engineering report should be discussing your safety related considerations, any issues you found, processes, resolutions, and any conclusions that you've made. And that level of detail in that documentation should be enough to describe your identification, your evaluation, and the final assessment of all serious use-related hazards for the device. So you should fully have characterized where those potential use-related issues are going to be. In order to facilitate an FDA review, for example, your materials that you've used in that process, so including portions of risk analyses focusing on user interactions with the device, specific risk analysis processes, results, and those conclusions should all be included in the report. So you need to be making reference to the protocol and any deviations from the protocol. Reference to the configuration of the product tested. So you ideally want to be in a position where you are using, in those final summative reports, you're using product that is completely relatable to your final product, but any differences and potential configuration aspects that differ from your final product should be identified within that report, and any reason why you could be considering those two products to be the same. The results from the test should be included, but also the location of any raw data and any post-test analysis that have been carried out. And then those conclusions that you're putting in there as to the safety and effectiveness should include the acceptance criteria as well. If you're making any changes to an existing product, now this is very much looking at the FDA process. So if you've got a change to design which has an effect on the dimensions, performance specifications, any wireless communications that you may have added, new components, new accessories, changes to the patient interface, and those changes significantly affect the use of the device, or as part of the risk assessment that you've completed, you've identified a new or a significantly modified risk. Now that can be an increased level of risk, or it can be a decreased level of risk. It's not discriminating between either. But if you're in either of those two situations, then you're going to need to put a new 510K submission in. And then we hit Europe. So just to kind of put this in context, the Medical Device Directive, and I'm purely focusing on medical device here rather than IVD, there are 5 clauses that reference usability. If you look at the Medical Device Regulation, which is the new regulation in Europe, which is coming into effect in May this year, there are 13 clauses that reference usability. So we've kind of got more than double the references in the regulation from the directive, which kind of indicate that Europe at least are focusing more on that usability piece as well. So if you're in a situation where you've got a user interface of, let's say, unknown provenance, so you've got a safety profile of a medical device which wasn't developed under 62366, potentially because it's a legacy product that's been on the market for 10, 20 years, and you want to make a change. Remember, there's no grandfathering under the medical device regulation. So you need to kind of consider your usability for the product as if it was a new product. So this is kind of our recommended process for how you identify that. It's the recommended process from 62366. So if your usability risk assessment or an equivalent risk analysis shows that your medical device has an acceptable risk, then you don't need additional usability data. But how do you get that? Because actually, if you've got unacceptable use-based risk, then you're probably going to want to do some usability testing to generate that data. So our recommendation is that you do a gap analysis against the medical device regulation requirements. So you'll be doing that anyway as part of your 62366 assessment and this non-harmonization of the standard against the regulation. And one of the questions that we'll be looking for are there any adequate records of the development of the usability engineering performed? And actually, in this particular instance, let's say that there aren't, because it was done before usability was a thing. Say you have a device that was developed around about 2000. If you haven't changed anything, or so your unmodified parts, you'll look at those parts using 62366 Part 1 Annex C. So, for example, let's take a worked example rather than theoretical conjecture here. If you wanted to add a new software interface to an existing device, the existing parts aren't changing, it's just that addition of a new software interface. So your existing parts, you assess using Annex C. Your new interface, you need to evaluate that using 62366 Part 1, sections 5.1 to 5.8. So that's your standard usability. And you then have a look and you say, right, okay, well, these are the things that we're going in place. So everything that you've got in your legacy part of the product, you're going to need to have in place a use specification, all your post-market information, so whether any complaints, existing use data, any hazards or hazardous situations that are associated with usability, any risks associated with usability, and an idea of what your overall residual risk will be. And you kind of collate all of that into your risk management file, which allows you to identify all of those risks that are caused by the user interface, including your new software interface. And that will give you an idea as to where you are in terms of whether you've got acceptable risk, in which case you probably don't need any additional usability data, or whether you've got unacceptable use-based risk, where you would want to be doing some usability testing to generate that data. So just a note on combination products in the US and drug device combination products in Europe. The process is largely the same as for medical devices, but obviously there's a pharma component associated with these as well. As a result, you may end up with some clinical trial crossover, just because it may not be possible for you to do some of your testing of your device without involving the drug product. It's becoming more relevant. So EMA, so the European Medicines Agency, released a reflection paper in 2017, which was around pharmaceutical development of medicines for use in the older population. And the FDA are currently working since 2018 on patient-focused drug development. So this is very much what Lucy alluded to earlier, where they're kind of saying, well, actually, hang on a minute, it's not enough to say that your device element or your medicinal product, drug product, is safe and effective. You've actually got to kind of think about whether it's the right choice of formulation of final presentation for your end user. So, for example, if you've got a tableting formulation for use in a geriatric patient who perhaps has dysphagia, so problems with swallowing, is a tablet the right formulation? Is that the right presentation for that elderly patient? Or actually, would they be better off from an early point of your development process and actually having something that was completely different in terms of formulation, assuming, of course, that you can formulate it in that way? Would they be better off with a injection product? Would they be better off with a dissolvable wafer, some other formulation that actually gets around that inherent problem that the user has, which potentially leads to an increase in your patient-reported outcomes, which also potentially leads to an increase in your reimbursement strategy as well. And then just a note on generic combination products. So in the US, the process is slightly different for an ANDA, because what you're actually demonstrating for that is that your generic product can be substituted for your reference listed drug, both clinically and usability wise, and that it has the same clinical effect under the condition specified. So in that particular instance, you are relying on the FDA's previous finding that the reference listed drug is safe and effective, so long as the ANDA applicant is demonstrating that the proposed drug product and the reference listed drug are the same with respect to the active ingredients, dosage form, route of administration, strength, and in some cases labeling. So in that case, your usability is slightly different, because you may be in a position where the usability of your proposed product would be significantly better, but you may have substitution issues because it may not be used in quite the same way as the originator product. And with that, I think we are through the detail of the presentation. I don't know if we've had any questions come through. I think we've possibly had a couple.
Yeah, and if now's the time to.
But if you've got any other questions, please do so. So we've had a couple come through. So our first question is, can you give an example of where you've seen a focus on usability giving a cost or timescale advantage in development? Lucy, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example of that. Okay, so yeah, so here's thinking back to a project that I was involved in a few years ago. It was a catheter project. It was a catheter for use in intensive care. And we had a focus on usability quite early in the product development process, which meant that very early on, when we weren't quite sure the format of this technology, and there was a couple of options for the technology on the table, we took early models of this catheter to some specialists within the ICU and created a simulated use test. Now, the models we took didn't really have any technology in them. They weren't very clever. We kind of made them out of other catheters, and we've got a workshop and lab here, and we made things in a very cheap and quick way so that we could take models to these specialists in the ICU very early, and they could hold the catheter, they could articulate the catheter, they could try it out, and we had a kind of basic training mannequin for this procedure. I can't talk about exactly where it was, but they were able to interact with the catheter models and interact with the mannequin and think about how they might use this new product. And there was a couple of options, was 3 options I think on the table. We weren't quite sure which route to take this idea down based on the unmet need, which was the best implementation of an idea to meet that need in terms of the interface. And so that piece of work basically eliminated a lot of those concepts as not really being very intuitive or fitting in with the workflow. But a couple of the concepts that we took, a couple of the models that we took, very much these specialists picked them up straight away and knew what to do and were able to use them, having never seen them before. And that meant that the development team didn't start developing a product which wasn't inevitably usable. So the technologies which could have met the need but weren't usable just weren't progressed, and it enabled us to focus the budget and the for that project on developing a technology which was ultimately going to work in the hands of the users and the environment for the application that they were using it for. So it certainly saved money and probably saved time, because it meant there wasn't resource going into, I guess, bad interface ideas or technologies which were difficult for people to interface with. Cool. You got any other questions? Another question? No.
Just scribing it across. Isn't technology wonderful?
Okay, what's phase? So it says, at what phase would you recommend a summative evaluation? Which clinical trial phase, 1, 2, or 3?
For a drug device combination with biologics.
So is that, sorry, I was just trying to read the question. Go off again. Oh, a summative. So as the summative evaluation is your final evaluation, which is about creating data to say that your interface is safe and effective. Now, the reality is that that can only be done once you have your final manufactured device and product. So it depends when in your clinical trial phases you have that. My assumption is that that will happen possibly at 2 and certainly at phase 3. And it may even, for drug delivery combination, happen while it may actually be your summative might take place during your phase 3 trial, depending on the situation and whether that's appropriate, or it might be a separate summative. But that's just the final summative evaluation. What should be happening all the way through, even before your phase 1, if you think that interface may involve risks that you want to understand, or that perhaps there's different concepts for interfaces or embodiments which could be considered before you even go in to any clinical trial. So while your final summative study might happen likely phase 3, but it could happen at phase 2 if you've tied down the device, or possibly even earlier if you've tied down the device earlier. I think the reality is this human factors testing of some kind provides a lot of value before that. And
I think, just adding to that, talking biologics, you're quite often potentially in a position where you might be in a situation where you actually physically need the device in order to carry out your first in human phase 1 trial. It's not sort of a commonly used pathway necessarily within a small molecular entity situation, because you'd be in a position where quite often if you've got a product that's ultimately going to end up in an auto-injector, you would probably carry out your first in human phase 1, your phase 2 clinical trials would be carried out probably with a vial and a syringe rather than using your final device. Certainly one of the things that we're seeing is that, particularly if you're talking around biologics, they're obviously large molecular entities. You may be using human cells as part of that study, but actually your device becomes really, really key, because it's the only way that you can actually transport your biologic material to the area of the body that you want to be transporting it to. At which point, if you can't do that, you really need to be considering your usability early, because you don't want to be having to cancel or postpone a clinical trial because you can't actually get your treatment to where it needs to get to. But we're also aware that, talking to large pharma companies, with my experience and Lucy's experience previously, is quite often you'll have that situation where you're talking to formulation teams and they're kind of saying, oh yeah, we need a device. You say, okay, that's great, when do you need a device? And they kind of come out with this, oh, the device needs to do this, it needs to deliver this, and we need to get it to this part of the body, and oh, by the way, our clinical trial starts in 3 months' time and we need the device for that. And the jaw kind of drops at that point. So I'd kind of, it's really, really useful to have those conversations as early as you possibly can, to kind of work out, where that device needs to come in and where you can kind of influence that, and obviously avoid spending that money where it's not necessary to do so.
Yeah. When you do your summative, really you need to have done your summative for regulatory submission. It's kind of independent of your clinical trials per se, right? However, it's really about project risk, program risk. Where is the risk of not having a device which is usable? If that risk is further up towards your phase 1, because it's so inherent in the efficacy of delivery of the drug or biologic or product, then it would be intelligent to do an awful lot of usability early up. While that's not necessarily your validation study, if it's your final device, you're using it phase 1 as you are at phase 3, then it might you could do your validation study at that point. But it would certainly be good from a program risk perspective to do a fairly decent human factors study earlier, so that you were confident in the performance of your clinical trial, which is always going to be a lot more expensive than a usability study. And in fact, we're doing a project at the moment where we are specifically doing a human factors program and study in order to de-risk a clinical trial, because at the end of the day, we need to get a decent device that delivers properly in order for that clinical trial to be valuable, and to and to start off the usability aspects of that drug device interface.
I hope that answers your question. Okay, so we've got another question. How can we justify if we need to integrate or not data from a formative study in our design?
Oh, that's actually that can be a difficult one. You can always make an interface better. However, there is always the constraints of time and cost and value of those. So a formative, there is always going to be a problem with there's always going to be small problems with an interface. And everything could be a little bit more intuitive. But if that formative has not happened early, it's often very difficult to take a step back in the development. If the technology is the cause of the interface problem, as opposed to the interface itself, it's about having, because the technology is forcing you to have to do something. So I'm just trying to click back to a previous slide. Yeah. Click back. Yeah. Yeah, this one here. So it really depends where you are in your development. On the left-hand side, if you've already developed your interface, then it can be difficult to justify changes to that interface when the design is locked down, when you've got to design freeze. However, there is options to change the instructional information and approach. And it's difficult from a commercial perspective, there's always that argument, but at the end of the day, it's about risk. So if you find something in a formative which has the potential to cause patient harm and comes up in your risk analysis as something which is important, and it's something you haven't even, it didn't come up in any of the other formatives for some reason. Maybe there's a new, maybe something's changed in the market that means people are approaching using a product in a new way that hadn't come up in all your previous formatives. If something pops up right at the end of the process and there's feedback on the user interface and it affects risk in a way that the regulators are going to be concerned about and has the potential to cause harm when it's in the market, then really you have to make those changes. At the other end is things about, you know, it could be a better user experience. You know, maybe it's not, maybe it's annoying, but it's not going to hurt anyone. Now, those things, from a regulatory perspective, you probably not going to want to make those if you're far down in your development, because it's going to incur lots of cost. However, while it doesn't affect use risk and regulatory risk for the company, there is commercial risk in poor user experiences. And so while there might be some recommendations that come back from a formative, which are not to do with risk, if, however, you think people will not choose your device because of that problem with the user interface, then there's at least a conversation to be had about the value of taking a step back, making tweaks to the user interface in order to delay launch. But this is all really coming back to the fact that the earlier you are doing usability with the lowest fidelity prototypes of your proposed interface, before there's lots of investment in the technology and the tooling, if you find those things out early, you're in a position to make those changes. Whereas if you're in the position where you're finding out things in a formative, it's often, and you're thinking about which ones should I change, which should I not, it's often because it might not be the case when you're writing this question, but from my experience, it's quite often the case. The reason you're questioning whether these changes need to be made is because a lot of the design's been tied down, when really it would have been so brilliant to have done that usability earlier, when you could have had these conversations without implicating product development costs so much. Anything to add to that? No, hope that answers your question. It's interesting getting questions without having any feedback or any subsequent questions, so we hope we're answering these well.
Okay, so I think that's it for the questions. If you kind of have any burning questions that keep you up at night, that you kind of decide that you need the answer to, our contact details are on the end of this. Slides will be available shortly after we've finished, but please feel free to drop either Lucy or myself an email, or get in contact via the phone at our Toft office. We'd love to answer your questions and help you out. So thank you very much for joining us today. Hope it's been useful for you, and we've kind of helped you along in your process. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Have a good day.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.